GitHub. I'm really creative with my names, obviously. These slides are all available on GitHub if you need. Object Partners, that's who we work for. We're consultants. If you need consultants, please hire us. We would like that. Today, we're just going to, like I said, we're just going to look at to see how custom directives actually communicate with the outside world in Angular. Very similar to React Component, to tell you the truth. And I mean, there's not a ton of us in here, so if you want to ask questions as I'm going, do not hesitate. So I'm going to get right into it. So this is right from the documentation. The directives are markers on a DOM element, an attribute element name, CSS class, to tell the compiler how to attach a specific behavior to that DOM element, right? So what does that mean? It really means that Angular is created in the library as the meta framework to help you teach the browser new tricks is what they use. So and the directives really are the glue between your DOM and the scope. So for your React fans or that have never used Angular, they're like your components, right? And of course, is very happy about that. So the compile service that comes with Angular can actually match directives the way when you write them in 4 different ways. The 2 most common and probably the most suggested are either an element or you can use them as an attribute. You can also do it as class names or comments if you want. But speaking as someone who usually has to come in and read your code, please don't. Sorry. Right, so this is kind of what it looks like in Angular when you're declaring a directive and referring to it in the HTML, right? So you create your little Angular module, and off of that you can chain a directive that you register a function that just returns a configuration object, or a recipe as they're called in Angular. And then you can refer to it, right? Jack Horseman. In your configuration, you can include a template, you restrict it to the element attributes, like we just spoke. There's transclusion. They made up their own vocabulary for including pieces of DOM, because that's pretty awesome about Google, right? You can replace the DOM element that you put it in there, or you just have it append to it. There's a compile on linking function, controller, and scope. All of those type of things can go on your directive. But today, all we're going to talk about really is scope. Because by default, all directives use the parent scope. So who's familiar with Angular scope? It's the scope object and kind of what it does. Right? So basically, all it is, it's a plain old JavaScript object that it holds all of your logic. Really, not your logic, but your business model. It takes the place of your business model. Right? So when you're using, you inherit the parent scope, if your directive is inheriting from the parent, you could actually break encapsulation. And if you're using a third-party directive and they're using the same variable on scope as you are, you can have the naming collision, overwrite each other. Right? So what we're going to want to do is be able to separate that scope in our directive that we're going to provide for other people to use from the actual outer scope. Right? And sometimes it looks kind of like this. So you have all of these divs. If you're to attach a controller and a scope object to each one of these divs, the default behavior of Angular is that you can actually, this div or this scope is going to be able to see this scope and this scope and this scope. So you can see how you can easily start overwriting yourselves. So how do you do that? Well, you can just configure a scope, right? You just tell the directive, hey, I want to be completely isolated from the rest of the application. That's all you got to do in your configuration.
Quick question.
Sure.
So in the end, do you overwrite or do you shadow? In the previous example.
In the previous example,
yeah.
So what do you mean by shadow?
Make a property invisible but not change it.
No, you would override. Yeah,
Okay.
in that case, yeah. Right? So with this, actually what it does is it creates an actual scope. So the way you want to look at Angular scope is functional scope in JavaScript, but applied to the DOM. That's really all it is. So it's exactly like JavaScript's functional scope, that they've attached it to a DOM element and all of the stuff that's in between there. So right, so an inner function can see the outer function scope. Right? Except in Angular, now they give you a configuration that you can cut off that. Right? So if we want to actually map some of that outer scope into our inner scope, instead of just telling it that we want an inner scope that's completely cut off, we actually can just give it a configuration to tell it how to map those properties that we're going to tell it to map, so we can make that communication happen. Right? There's multiple ways. The most common is the @ sign, right? And what the @ sign does is it maps the value of that attribute to, in the string, in the context of that parent scope, to your scope. So it works just like an attribute, right, in your DOM element, right? So if you say, hey, I have this attribute value, and it's going to be mapped as an attribute, which is just a string coming across, when you're actually using your directive, you pass in the attribute value, the value is just going to parse itself to 11. Does that kind of make sense? For everybody who's done Angular, that's kind of simple. The second way is to add actual two-way binding instead of just the one-way binding. Right? So if you say that some attribute is equal, what Angular will do is actually parse that as an Angular, it's going to parse it as an Angular expression. Thank you for helping me with that. Right? And so what's going to happen is now anything that happens in this view, in that outer scope, that changes my attribute, or some attribute, or the scope.myAttribute in the outer is going to change the value of some attribute. And if inside your directive you change the value of some attribute, it's actually automatically going to be reflected in my attribute for you. Right? So what that's doing is actually just creating a two-way binding in between there for you, from your isolate scope to your parent scope and vice versa. And then the third way, and actually one of the most underused, but I think is really, really powerful, is the ampersand. And what that does is it gives you a functional binding. So it allows you to pass in basically a callback into your directive to be called in the scope of the parent that has it, but you're going to be able to do it within your directive. Right? So here we're saying some calculation is, we say it's going to be a function so that we can call it on our scope in our linking function, which is part of the directive configuration outside of the scope of this talk. But a linking function is what the directive uses to basically do manipulations. Everybody can pretty much grasp that idea, right? And so if you're passing in the scope, we're saying some calculation, or we've called it down here, we're going to say, hey, this becomes an Angular expression at that point. So scope.calculate some value in a parent controller that lives outside of the scope of the scope of the directive, and we expect an argument called amount. Now this isn't straight JavaScript, it's an Angular expression, so when you call the function, you actually have to pass it an object, key value pairs, so that it can be mapped into that expression on scope. Okay? So that's all the talking I'm going to do. Right? And now I'm going to actually show stuff. So I tweeted today that I was pretty excited about tonight because I'm going to show like a way to make something, a solution to what I think is a world famous problem. And the problem that I have is that I really kind of hope that I can have Nick Nisi singing Quiet Riot lyrics to me on separate occasions. So I built an application that would do that for me. So this is what we're going to look at. So in an Angular application, we just have our typical ng app. That's how you scope. That's how you start up your Angular application. And what we've done is we're just binding a controller to this piece of DOM. So this controller is going to actually be our parent scope, or the outer scope. And then we've created a custom directive called the Nisi robot, or Nisi Riot, right? And then we've bound this, our header, to the riot.lyric. So anything that's in the controller riot is going to be reflected here on the lyric, right? And so this is what the JavaScript looks like, because that's what we really want to see, right? So here we've created our riot controller. This is our entire, where we've registered our Angular module in our application and stuff. So we've created a riot controller, right? This .lyric is going to call the lyric service, which is down here. Not that interesting, in order to grab the lyric. Okay? And then here is our directive, right? Nisi riot. And what that's going to do, we've restricted it to an element. We're going to replace, right? We're going to replace the DOM element. The template is just a div with the class of Nisinator, right? And then all it's going to do is it's just going to use an interval. It's going to write through the interval. It's going to move, detect if it's made a collision or not. We're going to reset directions if we need to move differently, and then we're going to go ahead and have it sing. Now by singing, I didn't really tap into the audio API or anything. I'm just going to display that in the lyric, right? So, and you can see, though, what I'm doing here in this first example is I'm actually passing in the scope, and we're getting a hold of that riot, right? Because we said that controller is named riot. We actually have this tightly coupled. This controller and this directive now are completely tightly coupled in order to post that. So we have no isolated scope because we're inheriting from it. So when you run it, right, it's like this. It starts up, right, and we got Nick moving across the screen, giving us a little smile. He's telling us to bang our head because mental health will drive us mad, right? Because he's got a mouth like an alligator. Okay, but right now this is moving too slow, and we have this really hard-coded. So we want to actually pass into our directive configuration. So that's what this next one is going to do for us, right? It's the same exact setup, except now we're saying we're going to have an attribute of interval and pass in a number. And within our script, right, we've said interval, @sign. So now interval is added onto our scope object that's passed into our linking function for us, right? And then it's going to increase the interval. So it's going to look something like this. Right? And I added some more styling because you know it's heavy metal, so we gotta have white on black, right? So any questions at that point, right? It's just taking it's basically passing in an attribute. You're just creating an HTML element with an attribute. Now this third one, right? Not only are we going to pass in the interval, but we want to decouple it a little bit from our controller. We're going to pass in the riot, right? It's riot.lyric. We're going to pass in that Angular expression, riot.lyric, so that we have access to it in our directive. So now we have interval and lyric added on scope. Lyric is two-way bound, right? So if we actually change lyric inside here, it's actually going to change the lyric on our parent scope, right? So now we're setting scope.lyric, we don't have any reference to riot, right? But it's still a little bit tightly coupled, right? Because it's actually got to know. So here, when we run it, I change the font a little bit, and Nick, yes, right? So is that more like a Vim font for you, Nick? Is that the way you like it? Okay, right? We're trying to make it look as Vim as possible, right? And so now he's bouncing around, and every time he bounces, we get another lyric, right? Because what's happening is once we detect a collision, we're going to reset this lyric. But this is still tightly coupled to our parent scope. So then the one last thing that I will do, right, is we're saying, hey, we want our directive to react to the collision, right? We want to be able to tell it what to do when it actually collides. And so here we're saying in our parent scope, call riot.sing and pass in that collision so that we can figure out which lyric we're going to sing at that point. And so in our controller, right, we've created riot.sing into the collision, and that code that used to live down in the directive now lives in the controller that actually is going to do the singing. That's where we want the singing to be happening, right? Or, you know, if you're actually doing this in the real world, whatever you really want to happen. So now you can see where we're running through. We've said the reactive collision is a functional expression, right, in our scope. So as we're running through the interval, now we just say scope reactive collision and just pass in the key value pattern for collision. And then when we run it, and we make it really fancy with taco cats, right? Then, does that make any sense? That kind of help anybody who's using Angular? Yeah. Right? Any questions?
What's with the cats?
They're tacos, but they're not. Right?
What's your opinion on the change? Oh, what's your opinion on the changes to Angular 2?
Who, I don't know, it's not built yet, right?
No.
So I can tell you that my, the Angular 1, when it came out, I laughed at it. I said, what are you doing putting stuff in the DOM? And then after about a year and a half, I kind of came around, because at that point it was Backbone or Angular, right? And then I came around because Angular was right, and I know that the Angular team is extremely bright.
Okay.
So if they say that this is the right way to do things, I'm going to give them the opportunity to prove to me that they're correct. There's a lot of things, like, so a lot of people said that React is their favorite technology, but React really is one, it just does one thing really well, right? The Angular provides you with so much more that makes it easy, especially if you're working on a big, gigantic, distributed team, that makes life a little bit easier to maintain. I'm interested to see. How about that? Is that yeah. I don't know. When I first saw it, I went, ugh! But then the more talks I see on it, and the more Bishko and Igor talk about their philosophy on things, you know, I was really excited about the new router, and then found out that the dude from Durandal is now bailing on it. So I don't know. We'll see. All I know is that we all write JavaScript, and we write JavaScript really well. So I don't care what they throw at me, as long as it does what I want it to do. So there's all my plunks if you wanted to grab those and you know, have fun with it and have your own Nick Nisi sing you a song. You can even change the lyrics, so he could sing you a love song or something, right? So as I wrap up, when do I use what? I use the @ symbol for typical script string values, one-way binding, right? I'm just going to pass a value in, very React-like, passing the value in. The equal sign for when I actually want to be able to manipulate two-way binding. But nowadays, I'm using the ampersand more than anything because it really disconnects my directive, my custom directive, from anything else. And I can make that directive do what I need it to do, and then have my outside scope control exactly what it is that it's going to do. Thanks.